Concluded. Questions without notice. Are there any questions? The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I inform the House that the Minister for Veterans Affairs and Minister for Defence Personnel will be absent from question time today, and the Minister for Defence will answer questions on his behalf.
Thank the Prime Minister. The Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Kate Jenkins has made shocking findings in her report today. Does the Prime Minister agree that everyone working in this building, including staff, deserve a safer and more respectful place at work?
The Prime Minister has
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I'm sure I join with the Leader of the Opposition and the leaders of all parties represented in this chamber, including the members of the crossbench, the Independents, the Leader of the Nationals, in answering that question on behalf of all of us, which is yes, Mr Speaker, of course we do. Because in this place, Mr Speaker, we are not just members, we are also employers individually. Each and every one of us are employers, and we have responsibilities as employers to make this workplace as safe as it possibly can be, Mr Speaker, as it possibly can be. And so today, the report, Mr Speaker, that Commissioner Jenkins has provided to all of us, to the government, Mr Speaker, and happy to table that report, Mr Speaker. This report, I think, goes to the root causes here that we have had to address in our workplaces. This is a challenge that, for those of us who have been in this place a long time, have been experienced over that course. And it deals with the issues of power imbalances. It deals with the issues of gender imbalances. It deals with the issues of accountability and independent complaint mechanisms, which I'm very pleased we have already taken action on, as we have with the counselling support and other services. We didn't have to wait, Mr Speaker, for this report before taking the action. I commend again Commissioner Jenkins, as I indeed have already commended Brittany Higgins, Mr Speaker, because it was her speaking up that has led to this chain of events, Mr Speaker, that has brought parties together in the multi-party process that has been working together to produce this set of recommendations. And I now look forward to us continuing to work together in a multi-party process. The recommendations cover the full terrain, I think, of the issues that need to be addressed, and we need to come together now and work to those together to ensure that this place becomes a safer place and set standards, Mr Speaker, for all who work in this building. The surveys that are in this report don't just relate actually to the staff of members of parliament and senators. They in fact relate to all people who work in this building. All people who work in this building, whether it's in the press gallery or elsewhere, Mr Speaker, amongst members, senators. And so it is important that we read this, reflect on it carefully, understand what Commissioner Jenkins has rightly set out as the drivers. As I said earlier today, we have the great privilege to work in this place, and all of those who are here also have that privilege. But the significant matters of state and the importance of our work and the stresses that we work under are no excuse whatsoever, Mr Speaker, for inappropriate behaviour, for bullying, for harassment, for any of these things, Mr Speaker. There is no place for that in this workplace or any others. So I join with all members of this House, and I'm sure the Leader of the Opposition, in condemning that behaviour and doing all we can, Mr Speaker, to make this a safer workplace for everyone in this building, and that is also the truth for those who work outside this building as well.
I give the call to the member for Reid.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to our Prime Minister. Australia has the best records on the COVID-19 pandemic of any other advanced nation, with amongst the lowest mortality rates, the strongest economy and the highest vaccination rates. Will our Prime Minister outline to the House how the Morrison government is continuing to keep Australians safe through the pandemic and secure our economic recovery, including the actions to address emerging COVID variants?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Reid for her question and the leadership she has shown in ensuring that the government's policies in response to the pandemic have been addressing the critical issue of mental health. We know that as a result of this pandemic, the immediate impacts have certainly been there, both physical and economic, Mr Speaker, but there will be a tail. There will be a tail of impacts on Australians' mental health as a result of this pandemic that Australia has stood out in addressing amongst the nations of the world, and I thank the member for her contribution to that in her professional capacity, but as a member of this House. Mr Speaker, throughout the pandemic, our government has always taken an evidence-based expert, informed and led response to save lives and livelihoods. We've always understood that we needed to get the balance between those, and that is what we have achieved. We have kept our heads, Mr Speaker. We have taken sensible, balanced, effective and cooperative action in our response to this pandemic, and the results, with the great support, endurance and strength of the Australian people, have been world-leading. The lowest fatality rates in the world from COVID, saving more than 30,000 lives in this country as a result of our combined efforts. One of the strongest advanced economies in the world to push through this pandemic, retaining our AAA credit rating, and in the last 5 weeks the Treasurer advised 350,000 jobs coming back after the lockdowns have ended, and we'll see that flow through into our economic figures in the months ahead. Mr Speaker, we have one of the highest vaccination rates in the world now, at 87% double-dosed, and in Western Australia and Queensland they're fast approaching that all-important 80% mark. Mr Speaker, we have confronted many challenges and overcome them, and the national plan we brought together and brought the states and territories together, Mr Speaker. That national plan is seeing Australia open safely so we can remain safely open. And the work that Australians have done has put us in a position now as we confront these new variants, and there's been 13 and we'll deal with this one. But, Mr Speaker, the work that has been done by Australians means now is not the time for turning back in terms of moving forward in our response to this virus. Mr Speaker, we have taken the sensible precaution for a 2-week pause on the next steps that we had, and we will examine the evidence and the advice that comes through, and we welcome that advice, and we have acted on that advice. Our response to Omicron, Mr Speaker, is sensible and balanced, and it's formed and it's calm, and we seek to maintain the momentum into Christmas so that we can continue to open up as Australians have worked hard to have those freedoms, Mr Speaker, so the government can over time continue to step back so Australians and the businesses they run can step forward. Premiers are meeting this afternoon. The flights have been suspended for this period of time, and we've reinforced, Mr Speaker, the strength of the PCR testing regime and giving that the enforcement capability. We are enabling Australians to continue to move forward.
And I give the call to the member for Hindmarsh.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Home Affairs Minister said today that Australia doesn't need purpose-built quarantine because hotel quarantine has worked very effectively. Can the Prime Minister confirm that there have been almost 30 breaches of hotel quarantine which have led to closed state borders and statewide lockdowns?
The Prime Minister has.
Thank you, Mr Speaker, for the question. And this has been the experience throughout the pandemic, Mr Speaker. They say they seek to support the response on one hand, Mr Speaker, and then on the other hand, Mr Speaker, having a bet each way on the pandemic response is what I've become and the government has become very used to. They support JobKeeper, they bag JobKeeper, Mr Speaker, even in this place, a program that saved hundreds of thousands of jobs.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The member for Hindmarsh has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. On direct relevance, we didn't ask about the opposition's views. We asked about hotel quarantine.
The Prime Minister is entitled to a preamble. He is talking about hotel quarantine. He is talking about. He is on point. He is on point, and the Prime Minister is entitled to a preamble in any event. And I give the call to the Prime Minister.
And thank you, Mr Speaker. And one of the most urgent actions taken in the course of our response to the pandemic, as we looked into the abyss back in the early part of 2020, Mr Speaker, was to move quickly to ensure that we could put in place a system where those coming into Australia would quarantine, and together with the states and territories, who are meeting together with me again this afternoon, we put that scheme in place and supported them, Mr Speaker, to do that, and followed that up with the establishment of the National Resilience Facility in the Northern Territory, which has a capacity of 2,000, Mr Speaker. Now, I note that those opposite make reference to the hotel quarantine system, Mr Speaker. I can tell you, Mr Speaker, that system, Mr Speaker, while certainly not perfect, but in the context of hundreds of thousands of people, Mr Speaker, who came through then on less than 10 occasions, not as the member put in the question, On less than 10 occasions, Mr Speaker, there were breaches in that scheme that led to the outcomes that the member referred to. Now, Mr Speaker, in the context of hundreds of thousands of Australians who are coming back over that period of time, I thank the states and territories whom we worked with closely to put this into place, Mr Speaker. I thank them for the work they did. Those opposite, Mr Speaker, may wish to condemn them, but then that would be the same thing they have done throughout this pandemic. Mr Speaker, they're happy to say they support, so as long on the other hand, Mr Speaker, they can undermine. And that's why, Mr Speaker, it hasn't been our experience that we've had the confidence to rely on those opposite, Mr Speaker. We have forged the way of this government, Mr Speaker, on these benches and with other governments around the country because those opposite simply couldn't be relied upon, Mr Speaker.
The member for Flynn has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Deputy Prime Minister and Minister presenting the Minister for Resources and Water. Will the Deputy Prime Minister please provide an update to the House on how the Australian resources and energy sector is driving our economy through record exports and what this means to regional communities like those I represent? Is the Deputy Prime Minister aware of alternative policy approaches?
The Deputy Prime Minister representing the Minister for Resources and Water has the call.
Well,
Order.
Mr Speaker,
Order.
Mr Speaker,
Deputy
I
Prime
thank
Minister.
the honourable member for his question and might bring some attention to some of the deriding sneers that happen across the chamber at a person who has been a very accomplished business person who has stood behind the great city of Gladstone, a deneering sneer towards the member for Flynn as a deneering sneer to the people of the great city of Gladstone and the people of central Queensland. It follows their usual line of thinking that regional people are somehow below contempt. But, Mr Speaker, the minerals industry is so vitally important for our nation. Mr Speaker, when we look at exactly what Australia produces, iron ore and concentrates, over $153 billion in exports in 2021. Coal, over $39 billion in exports, and I'll say a little bit more about that later on. Natural gas in excess of $30 billion. Then education-related travel services at $26.6. Then gold again, another mineral at over $26 billion. Then beef at 8.3, and then aluminium and ores at over 8.1. Mr Speaker, you can see that it's followed up with copper ores, crude petroleum and then wheat. In those top 10, Mr Speaker, one is from the service industry. Everything else is from primary production. And for our terms of trade, Mr Speaker, if we are not putting things on the boat that the world wants, we are not going to be able to get all the things off the boat that are so emblematic in the lives we lead, from the fuel in our car to the car we drive to the phone we listen on to the clothes on our back. Product that comes off the boat is determined by people's desire for our currency, and our currency is determined by people's desire for the products that they buy off us and their minerals. Mr Speaker, the honourable member for Flynn talked about alternate policies, and we know that within the Labor Green caucus there is a desire to shut down our coal industry, to shut down our gas industry, to move away from fossil fuels, but they never tell us what they're going to replace it with. Mr Speaker, the member for Grayndler went up to Moranbah. He wouldn't even take a media contingent with him, saying that a Facebook post was as far as he was going to go. He might have been in Mooloolaba as Moranbah. Who would have known? He was never seen near a coal mine. He was never seen with mine workers in the media. So we are proud. We are proud of our mineral exports. We understand where the wealth of this nation comes. We'll continue to stand behind the people of the great city of Gladstone, and we won't be the sneering cohort that we see on the other side.
The member for Gorton has the call.
Back to the harbour for you, Sunshine.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The Home Affairs Minister said today we do not need purpose-built quarantine because hotel quarantine had worked very effectively. How many state borders have been closed and how many lockdowns have occurred because of the Prime Minister's reliance on hotel quarantine instead of purpose-built quarantine facilities?
The Prime Minister has the floor.
Well, Mr Speaker, the Commonwealth Government has established and did establish the National Resilience Facility, Mr Speaker. And so the questioner is in error to suggest that the Commonwealth has not established those facilities. We indeed have, Mr Speaker, and they were there to support. Mr Speaker, the broader quarantine arrangements that were put in place necessarily with all the states and territories, because the sheer volume of arrivals that would come back to Australia and needed to be accommodated in that way. The Labor Party seems to think that we would have somehow established facilities to accommodate 100,000 people around the country, Mr Speaker. I mean, that's simply absurd. So we came up with a practical, innovative solution, Mr Speaker, a solution that was actually followed by the New Zealand government, Mr
Members
Speaker.
on my left.
And I don't hear those opposite criticising the Labor government in New Zealand about having hotel quarantine, Mr Speaker. But they're happy to criticise their own government for doing it, Mr Speaker. They're happy to criticise the Australian government for taking exactly the same response to the New Zealand government, which tells you everything about this Labor opposition when it comes to the handling of the pandemic.
The Manager of Opposition on a point of order.
On direct relevance, Mr Speaker, and I put it that we're at the point now where it's quite a deliberate breach of the standing orders from the Prime Minister that he knows there's no reference to alternative policies or alternative approaches, and every single time he has to pivot to an attack on the opposition. The question does not invite that.
The Manager of Opposition Business will resume his seat. The Prime Minister will remain relevant to the question.
Yeah.
The Prime Minister has
Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition may wish to reflect on the chair and those comments, Mr Speaker. He may wish to reflect on the chair, Mr Speaker, but that goes to the nature of the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker. Happy to play political games in here every other day of the week.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
Standing Order 91, the Prime Minister's disregarding your ruling.
The Manager of Opposition will resume his seat. The Prime Minister will return to the dispatch box and remain relevant to the question.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I will resist responding to the sneering interjections of the Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker, because what Australians know is, as a result of the response to this pandemic, Mr Speaker, more than 30,000 lives have been saved by the very arrangements we put in place with the states and territories. Now, those opposite might want to sneer at that and not support it, Mr Speaker, but this country has come through this pandemic and continues to move through this pandemic, particularly, Mr Speaker, in response to new variants, and we are dealing with Omicron now in a calm and sensible and balanced way. We'll deal with other governments on these issues because we know when it comes to the pandemic, the Labor Party always plays politics before putting forward the national interest.
The member for Melbourne has the call.
My question is to the Prime Minister. Official data released today shows emissions have just gone up by 2% under your government. But the Independent Climate Targets Panel has determined that for Australia to meet the Glasgow Climate Pact requirement to keep global warming below 1.5 degrees, emissions must be cut by at least 74% by 2030. Given Australia will be required to update our targets in Egypt next year, will you take a 75% by 2030 target to the next election? Or is the only way we're going to get science-based climate targets to kick your terrible government out and put the Greens in balance of power?
The Prime Minister has the call. The Prime Minister has the call. Order.
Mr Speaker.
Order.
I thank the Shadow Deputy Leader of the Opposition, Mr Speaker, in what hopes to be a Green Labor government, Mr Speaker, after the next election. That's what they hope for. They're calling themselves shadow ministers down there in the Greens, Mr Speaker. I tell you what, they'll never be in an alignment with this government, Mr Speaker. There will never be, and there never has been, Mr Speaker, a Liberal Nationals Green government. But, Mr Speaker, I do know that the Labor Party did a deal in government with the Greens to bring in the carbon tax. I know they formed an alliance with the Greens, Mr Speaker, last time they were in the government. I remember the photo. It was almost, Mr Speaker, as shameful as the photo we saw with the former Leader of the Opposition measuring up the curtains before the last election with all the hubris, Mr Speaker. So there they are, getting ready, Mr Speaker, thinking the Greens and Labor are going to walk onto the Treasury benches of this country.
The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order. 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 Members on my right, the Leader of the Opposition. On a point of order.
On relevance, Mr Speaker. Well, hang on. Sit down.
I'm still hearing.
You sit down, Buffett. You sit down. I've got the
Leader
call.
of the House will
I've got the
resume
call.
his seat.
Sit down.
The Leader of the Opposition, on point of order of relevance.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. On relevance, the only coalition in this parliament is the rabble over there.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Leader of the House.
Mr Speaker, if there was a standing order on glass jaws, he would be in order.
The
Clearly, there is
Leader
not,
of the House,
and he should be sat down.
The Leader of the House will resume his seat. Order. The question asked by the member for Melbourne was extraordinarily broad, and I would ask the Prime Minister to return to the dispatch box.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I note that the Leader of the Opposition takes objection to the suggestion that the Greens and Labor would actually form a coalition. Now, where would I get that idea from, Mr Speaker? They actually did it, Mr Speaker. They actually did it when they were last in government. And I remember many years ago when Lindsay Tanner, the former member for Melbourne, Mr Speaker, the former member for Melbourne said, I think it was before the 2004 election, Mr Speaker, and he said, you know, if it's a close election, we might have to do some of the crazy things the Greens want us to do, Mr Speaker. That's what the former member for Melbourne says, and now a Greens member sits in that former Labor seat, just as a Greens leader would seek to sit in a Labor government, Mr Speaker. So I can tell the member that under our government, Mr Speaker, emissions have fallen by over 20%, Mr Speaker. Under our government, I can tell you, Mr Speaker, that we have a target for 2030, which we took to the Australian people at the last election, and we will meet and beat, and we'll see emissions fall by 35% by 2030. The Labor Greens target, Mr Speaker, not set yet. They still haven't told you what they want to do in 2030. There's no plan for 2030. There's no plan for 2050. We've been very clear that we will do this through technology, not taxes, but Labor, forced by the Greens, will tax you on that issue.
The member for Moore has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Treasurer. Will the Treasurer explain to the House how the Morrison government's strong and measured economic management is helping the Australian economy to weather the COVID-19 pandemic, especially with the new Omicron variant? And is the Treasurer aware of any alternative approaches?
The Treasurer has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Moore for his question, acknowledge his experience as a councillor, as an accountant, and he's famous for his calendars, Mr Speaker, in this place. Now, as we approach Christmas, it's appropriate to reflect on how far this country has come in the last 2 years. Last March, consumer and business confidence fell to their lowest levels on record. And we saw thousands of our fellow Australians having lost their jobs lining up outside Centrelink. And Treasury were forecasting that unemployment could reach as high as 15%. Now, we responded with programs like JobKeeper, the cash flow boost, support for veterans and carers and pensioners and others on income support. And Australia, ahead of any other advanced economy in the world, saw GDP higher than it was going into the pandemic, and it saw employment higher than it was going into the pandemic. Then we were hit by Delta, and our two largest states went into lockdown. And we responded with around $20 billion of economic support. And now restrictions are easing and our economy is on the road to recovery. Now, there are new variants like Omicron, and we know that we are in a strong position to respond with one of the highest vaccination rates in the world and one of the strongest economies in the world. Now, this is our track record. After the biggest economic shock since the Great Depression, unemployment today is lower than when Labor left office, Mr Speaker. Now, I'm asked, are there any alternative approaches? Well, we know this weak Labor leader, does not have the courage to come clean with his policies to the Australian people. And this weak Labor leader will not stop.
The Treasurer will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on point of order.
Yes, Mr Speaker, it's not in order for the Treasurer to just sledge members of the opposition. It's not a policy debate, it's just a personal sledge, and it's out of order.
The Manager of Opposition Business, I'm happy to hear from you on a particular standing order if you want to take me to that.
Speaker, I'll give you a few different ways, but if you start with direct relevance. Now,
on what, sorry?
Direct relevance. There's nothing in the question that invites a character assessment. The question, if the question's inviting, or you've allowed both alternative policies and alternative approaches. What the Treasurer is doing now is neither. He's not referring to an alternative policy. He's just giving a character assessment sledge. He's not referring to an alternative approach. He's just giving a character assessment sledge. If we go down this path, question time just continues to go downhill. And in terms of the standards of the place, this is beyond what the question invites on direct relevance.
The Leader of the House.
Well, Mr Speaker, it's a bit rich, if I might say, for the Leader of the Opposition, who sits there sledging constantly all question time, to somehow all of a sudden be all virtuous. Now, if he's got a glass jaw, he's got a glass jaw. The whole debate in this place, back and forth, is about a contest of ideas, and you sit there weak as water all day.
Leader of the Opposition.
On the point of order that was raised by the Leader of the House.
No, he wasn't. He was just responding to.
He was responding about a point of order.
He was
responding, and he invited. He said he was up for a debate. We're up for a debate. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 20 minutes, whatever you want, mate. Anyone on your side on any policy of your choice.
Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. Order. Order. Member for Wills. One of the issues that the Jenkins report deals with is respect, and I'm not quite sure what whoever found that so funny laughed out loud then, but I would call upon members of the House to, as I said in my first speech as Speaker, I don't expect this place to be a monastical library. But the Australian public does not want to see this place descend into a political coliseum. There will be a lot of discussion over the next days and weeks over respect in this place, and I would ask members, all members, to show that level of respect in this chamber as well. And I'll give the call to the Treasurer.
Mr Speaker, with apology, there is a policy from the Leader of the Opposition, and that's for a Nationals driver's licence, Mr Speaker. And there is a policy from the Leader of the Opposition, and that is to waste $6 billion of taxpayers' money giving for people who have already had the jab to get a payment, Mr Speaker. The reality is this weak Leader of the Opposition will not stand up to the shadow ministers in the Greens.
Has the Treasurer finished his answer? No. The Manager of Opposition Business.
Mr Speaker, under Standing Order 91, you made a ruling as to what the standard should be. The Treasurer has now gone back to the exact language he was using before you made that ruling.
Well, look, I didn't rule on those words. I called upon all members to be respectful in this place, and I would ask the Treasurer to do the same. The Treasurer has the call.
Mr Speaker, the fact is that if given half a chance on the Treasury benches, this Leader of the Opposition will increase taxes on the Australian people. Whether it's family businesses, whether it's superannuation, whether it's income taxes, whether it's franking credits and retirees, whether it's housing, Mr Speaker. And we know that from their previous record, and we know that from the $387 billion of high taxes they took to the Australian people.
The member for Hindmarsh has the call.
See, that was powerful.
Thank you again, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. In her National Review of Quarantine published this month, the Prime Minister's hand-picked quarantine advisor, Jane Holton, told him, and I quote, "Some quarantine settings, such as quarantine in a purpose-built facility, are better able to mitigate transmission risks, especially for high-risk travellers and in respect of variants of concern." And further that, and I quote, "The Centre for National Resilience at Howard Springs was not purpose-built for quarantine. Why has the Prime Minister failed to establish a single purpose-built quarantine facility?"
The Prime Minister has the call.
The member will be aware that that was a report that I, in fact, commissioned, Mr Speaker. That was a report I commissioned, and, Mr Speaker, that led in the process of developing that report to the decisions that were taken for the additional facilities, Mr Speaker, that are being completed in Victoria, in Queensland, Mr Speaker, and in Western Australia. Mr Speaker, those facilities are important not just for what we may have to face next year for the more severe cases that may have to be taken, and as we've discussed those with state governments, but for future pandemics that may present in the future, and that's why we have invested in those facilities. So, Mr Speaker, I would only encourage those opposite. As Australians continue to push through this pandemic, and as we continue to face these new variants of concern, and it is a variant of concern, but we've dealt with many before. What I do know from certainly the Premier of New South Wales, and I appreciate the measures that they've taken in relation to this most recent variant, and I believe the view was also held by the Victorian Premier, that we don't want to return to those arrangements that were put in place for those quarantine facilities, that is in hotels, Mr Speaker, that they are moving now to home quarantine. Home quarantine and isolation, and that is how we live with the virus, and we live together with the virus. Now, those opposite have been playing politics with this pandemic for 18 months, Mr Speaker. Australians know that our government has worked closely with others to ensure that we have one of the highest vaccination rates in the world. We have one of the strongest economies coming through this pandemic, of advanced economies in the world, and we have one of the lowest fatality rates, Mr Speaker, of any country in the world from COVID. So what part of those three results, Mr Speaker, that many other countries, in fact most around the world, would happily exchange places with Australia to have achieved, do they find so offensive, Mr Speaker? So offensive. Why is it, Mr Speaker, that this opposition constantly throughout this pandemic has not sought to support but has only sought to undermine for their petty political purpose?
Member for Chifley. Member for Chifley. The member for McKellar has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Health and Aged Care. Can the Minister please inform the House how the Morrison government is dealing with new COVID variants such as Omicron, and how our vaccine rollout has helped protect Australians?
The Minister for Health and Aged Care has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker, and I want to thank the member for McKellar and acknowledge that his electorate has achieved a 95% double-dosed vaccination rate. And that's helping to save lives and protect lives, as the vaccination program is around Australia. And indeed, just in the last 24 hours, another 650,000 cases worldwide, over 7,300 lives lost officially. And so the pandemic, which some would almost pretend was not a pandemic but was uniquely an Australian event. In fact, it's a global pandemic which has wreaked profound impact around the world, but Australia, thankfully, has had one of the highest vaccination rates in the world, one of the lowest losses of life in the world, with over 30,000 lives saved by comparison with the OECD average, and 45,000 lives saved by comparison with those agonies that we've seen in the great nations of the United States and the United Kingdom, and one of the strongest economic recoveries. All of these things have come together. The program that we put in place to protect Australians, borders, testing, tracing, distancing and the vaccination program has worked together through these rings of containment to give Australians some of the strongest outcomes of any nation in the world. And let us never forget, as a parliament, that of all the nations in the world, Australia is one of the few with a loss of life that is so limited. Each life lost is to be deeply regretted, but no nation is immune. But few nations have done better than Australia. That's what is fundamentally important. And now, as we face the latest news about the Omicron variant, we know that the very systems that were established on our watch, in our time, have been put in place immediately. On Saturday, off the back of the briefing with the Chief Medical Officer and the Secretary of Health, the Prime Minister instructed that we take steps to cease flights from the southern African nations, that we sadly put in place a pause on non-Australian arrivals from the southern African nations, that we would ensure that there would be quarantine for those who have been in the southern African nations, and to ensure that we made efforts to ensure that all those who had already arrived in Australia were put in quarantine. These elements have come together. They are saving lives and protecting lives. Now additional measures have been taken by the National Security Committee overnight with regards to new arrivals and pausing those for 14 days. Together, these actions are protecting Australia and continuing to protect Australia.
The member for Canberra has the call.
Thank you, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Can the Prime Minister confirm, in a report released this month, the Prime Minister's hand-picked quarantine advisor, Jane Holton, told him purpose-built facilities represent the gold standard of quarantine and monitoring variants of concern should ensure high-risk travellers are allocated to these purpose-built facilities. Can the Prime Minister confirm he has failed to establish a single purpose-built quarantine facility?
The Prime Minister has
that
the call.
report. I thank the member for his question. Mr. Speaker, we are doing exactly that as recommended. Exactly that as recommended, Mr. Speaker. But I reinforce what I've already said to this House, that over the course of this pandemic, the arrangements we put in place, Mr. Speaker, that unlike other countries, and the Minister for Health has just made the reference, OECD countries, had we gone down the same path and not taken the steps that we did take, more than 30,000 Australians would be dead today, Mr. Speaker. 30,000 Australians would have perished in this pandemic were it not for the timely and effective measures that this government put in place, working with the states and territories, Mr. Speaker, to ensure that result. And not only that, the economic strength that this country has shown through the course of this pandemic, some 350,000 people coming back into work, ensuring that the structure and strength of our economy was maintained through the pandemic so it can be springing back now after the lockdowns have been over and seeing Australians going back into work. I was talking to the Confederation of Australian Industry this morning. And, Mr. Speaker, throughout the pandemic, Australian businesses were taking advantage of the investment allowances we put in place in the budget to set up for the economic recovery. And, Mr. Speaker, their vote of confidence in the Australian economy in the midst of a pandemic shows great character and shows great resilience and fortitude, and that is what is setting up the opportunity in the years ahead. But we cannot take that economic recovery for granted. Australia must secure this economic recovery, Mr Speaker, and that requires the continued economic policy settings which our government has put in place for a business-led recovery, Mr Speaker, for an enterprise-led recovery, for an entrepreneur-led recovery, not having government crowd that out, Mr Speaker, as those opposite would do, and not understanding when it's time for governments to step back so Australians and Australian businesses step forward. That will only risk that recovery. The higher taxing DNA of the Labor Party will only risk that recovery, Mr Speaker. And that's why we must secure that recovery with the policies.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The question goes to the member for Lindsay. Has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Home Affairs. Will the minister please update the House on how the Morrison government is dealing with the challenges of the Omicron variant while continuing to ensure the safe reopening of our international border, as part of our plan to secure Australia's economic recovery and return to our way of life?
The Minister for Home Affairs has the call.
Good Minister. Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for her question and also for her great advocacy in Western Sydney on a wide range of issues, including a number of matters in home affairs. Mr Speaker, late last week we became aware of the Omicron variant, which presents a range of new challenges for us here in Australia and also globally. Now, it's very early days. The world is yet to have a complete understanding of it, and here in Australia, of course, we need to learn more about that particular variant. That's why this government took the very sensible step last night to place a 2-week pause on our planned reopening, stage 2 of our border reopening from December 1. So it would be a 14-day pause from the 1st of December for a number of cohorts that we had previously indicated we were going to be able to open to. Those cohorts include economic workers, skilled workers, it includes international students, humanitarian refugees, temporary visa holders. And also, we've had to pause our reopening to citizens of Japan and South Korea. That pause will be in place for a period of 14 days to make sure that there is time, particularly in Australia, for our health professionals to understand more about this new variant. Now, this is not a decision that the government took lightly. We know that many plans had been made. We know that businesses are desperately wanting skilled workers, and they need those skilled workers here. We know that visa holders in Australia want to be able to see loved ones, many of whom are overseas that they have been separated from for a very long period of time, and many of those people want to come to Australia to visit us here. So we're very mindful of the impact that those border changes have on many individuals, on many families and, of course, on many businesses here in Australia. And we certainly feel for all of those who have been affected. But we took this very sensible and this very prudent decision based on health advice. And that advice was that we needed to put in place a pause on the next stage of reopening our international borders. Now, the Morrison government is absolutely committed to doing all that we can to reopen those borders as soon as we possibly can, but we need to do that in a very safe and considered manner. That's why the decision was taken last night that we would pause our international arrivals that we had planned to allow into this country as of the 1st of December. Now, we need to be very conscious as we move forward that we need to bring in those skilled workers, and again, the Morrison government will do all that it can to make sure that we open our international borders as safely and as quickly as we can.
The honourable member's time has expired, and I give the call to the Leader of the Opposition.
Thanks, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. The 2022 parliamentary calendar of the Morrison-Joyce government has in practice only 10 sitting days for the House and 5 for the Senate before August. Doesn't this show the Prime Minister has no intention of establishing a federal anti-corruption commission before the election?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker. The Leader of the Opposition knows full well that we have 349 pages of legislation and $150 million, Mr Speaker, committed to this measure. All it takes is for the Labor Party to support it, which they don't. They have a two-page policy.
Members on my left.
A two-page policy, Mr Speaker. We have a 349-page set of legislation, which, if they wish to support, Mr Speaker, we would welcome that. But I'm asked also about the parliamentary calendar, which is, I know, a topic that the Leader of the Opposition has been paying keen interest in. Now, Mr Speaker, as the Leader of the Opposition may not be aware, that in order to prepare a budget, Mr Speaker, next year, the normal practice is to ensure there are a set number of weeks before the preparation of that budget, before the budget is delivered. Now, Mr Speaker, I've personally delivered 3 budgets as a Treasurer, as there have been 3 budgets as Prime Minister, Mr Speaker, and I have served 7 years on the Expenditure Review Committee, Mr Speaker. Now, I can understand why the Leader of the Opposition would be unfamiliar with the time taken to prepare a budget, Mr Speaker, because he's never delivered one, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, there are people who have been serving refreshments in the Expenditure Review Committee longer than this person, Mr Speaker, the Leader of the Opposition, spent in that chamber, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, our government knows how important the economic recovery for this country is as we emerge from the pandemic. And we have the economic management experience to ensure that we secure that recovery. Last year's budget, Mr Speaker, set out once again the further iteration of that economic recovery plan. That economic recovery plan that has already seen 217,000 Australians who are currently in trade apprentice training right now, Mr Speaker, the highest level on record since 1963.
The Prime Minister will resume his seat. The Leader of the Opposition on a point of order.
Speaker, on relevance, the question was about an anti-corruption commission and whether the government has any intention of introducing and dealing with that legislation prior to the next election.
The question was posed also in relation to the 2022 parliamentary calendar. The Prime Minister is on point in relation to the calendar. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. That economic recovery, Mr Speaker, as we go into next year and we do the preparations for next year's budget, will continue to support measures that keep Australians in work. Now, Mr Speaker, under our government there are 1 million Australians who are working in manufacturing today. Mr Speaker, I was in Adelaide on Friday and I met former Holden workers, Mr Speaker, now working in manufacturing. Now working in manufacturing again, Mr Speaker, in the medical industry.
The Manager of Opposition on a point of order.
On a point of order, Mr Speaker, you ruled before that the Prime Minister would be in order if he was talking about the parliamentary calendar or the Anti-Corruption Commission, and I don't see how this is either, even close to either.
Your point of order is in relation to relevance. But
it's in relation to your previous ruling. I wouldn't be allowed to make one on relevance.
Point of relevance. The Manager of Opposition Business will resume his seat. The Prime Minister will be relevant to the question.
Well, thank you, Mr Speaker, and I can understand why the member for Watson also doesn't understand why it is relevant that you need to set a parliamentary calendar which enables you to bring down a budget, Mr Speaker, a budget that is absolutely critical to the economic recovery of this country. Those opposite don't understand budgets, Mr Speaker. They don't understand economic management, and the Australian people do not trust them on economic management. That's why when they look at these things, all they see the parliament for, Mr Speaker, is an opportunity to come in here and play their little parliamentary games. Mr Speaker, in government, the job is to put together a budget.
The Manager of Opposition Business on a point of order.
I was just letting you know the time had expired some time ago.
The Manager of Opposition Business.
You are a good little timekeeper.
The member for just before I call the member for Ryan, the interjections from both sides of the House is far too high. A number of members, well, one member has received a warning. I will start acting under 94A. The member for Ryan has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. And my question is to the Minister for Defence. Will the Minister please update the House on how the Morrison government's partnership with the United States and the United Kingdom is ensuring that Australia can meet the threats posed by the changing strategic environment, and is the Minister aware of any alternative approaches?
The Minister for Defence has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. I thank the honourable member for Ryan for his question, acknowledge the hard work that he does in his local community, supporting all of those that work and live on the barracks at Enoggera, Gallipoli Barracks, and the strong support he provides to those veterans and to their families. Mr Speaker, as we know, the Indo-Pacific is witnessing a dramatic military build-up. We know that the Chinese government has 355 vessels, boats and submarines. They have an increase in that number to 460 by the end of 2030. And we know that over an 18-month period at the moment, they're producing on a tonnage rate more in their naval fleet than what the Australian Royal Australian Navy has in its entire fleet, Mr Speaker. We know that overnight the United States has just released its Global Force Posture Review, and that review,
is warned.
Mr Speaker, directs additional cooperation with allies and partners to contribute to Indo-Pacific stability and deter potential Chinese military aggression. Mr Speaker, this is why the Australian government has entered into the AUKUS arrangement with both the United States and the United Kingdom to make sure that we can take steps to keep our country safe and secure now and into the future. And as part of the deal on AUKUS, we have, of course, announced that we are going to acquire, Mr Speaker, to build at least eight nuclear-propelled submarines. That gives them the stealth and the ability to operate in the Indo-Pacific to protect our country and our interests and the interests of our friends. And part of that process, Mr Speaker, means that there needs to be a consultation through the IAEA, the International Atomic Energy Agency, to sign off on the deal. And there has been some opposition, Mr Speaker, and I note that there's some opposition from those opposite, because, as we know on national security, this Leader of the Opposition always plays both sides of the fence. There's always an each-way bet on national security for the Labor Party. In here they say they're in support of AUKUS, and when they get outside they tell a very different story. But I noticed yesterday, Mr Speaker, that the member for Fremantle, in relation to this IAEA process, says, and I quote here, he says in relation to our country, to Australia, that we will have broken new ground in weakening the existing non-proliferation regime. Now, those words sounded familiar, Mr Speaker, because when you look at those that have contributed to the process at the Energy Agency, there's only two other countries that are making a claim that Australia is not doing the right thing here. That is the Chinese government and the Russian government. Those two. So, Comrade Wilson, you are on message. You're on message, and weak leader here would be very proud of you.
The Leader of the Opposition.
Yes, Mr Speaker. I seek leave to move the following motion: that the House declares our support for our alliances with the United States and the United Kingdom.
Is leave granted?
You don't grant leave to stunts, Mr Speaker. And I'll tell you what, you could speak here all day, you wouldn't convince the Australian public you're strong.
The member for Sydney has the call. Order. 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 Members on my left. If members on my left and members on my right want me to hear the question, they'll stop their interjections. The member for Sydney has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister's model of a National Anti-Corruption Commission have the power to investigate the Energy Minister's use of forged documents to attack the Lord Mayor of Sydney?
The Leader of the House has the call.
Thank you very much, Mr Speaker. The standing orders are very clear in relation to those sort of baseless allegations impugning a member of this House. And, Mr Speaker, they are false allegations, unfounded, and it should be withdrawn.
I'm happy to hear from the Manager of Opposition Business.
Mr Speaker, it's been the case for quite some time that if a minister wants to reject something within a question, they have the opportunity to do so in the answer. But the question does not assert something as fact. It asks a question. It asks the question,
but, the Manager of Opposition Business will resume his seat. The Standing Order 100D Roman numeral 4 talks about imputations, and certainly there's an imputation in that question. I'm happy to give the questioner the opportunity to reword the question. I can come back to the member for Sydney.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister's model of a National Anti-Corruption Commission have the power to investigate the use of forged documents to attack a Lord Mayor?
The Minister has the call.
Well, I do thank the Prime Minister for the opportunity to respond to the question asked by the member for Sydney. Our model will deal with serious allegations of serious criminal corruption at the Commonwealth level. That is what our model will do. It's a well-developed, serious, substantiated model. And if the opposition was serious about engaging in it, if the opposition was serious about tackling the risk and challenge of serious, suspected serious criminal corruption at the Commonwealth level, what they would do is engage seriously with this government on what we've put on the full text, the 349 pages of legislation which have been out there for many months, rather than engaging in a series of political stunts, Mr Speaker. One side of this House is genuine and serious-minded about engaging on the issue of suspected Commonwealth criminal corruption. One side of this House has detailed exposure draft legislation which is out there ready to go, and the other side of this House is sitting on its hands doing nothing, and they need to take a good hard look at themselves.
The member for Boothby has the
Thank you, Mr Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Education and Youth. The Morrison government is securing Australia's economic recovery by investing in technology and research. Will the minister please update the House on the government's university research commercialisation agenda and how this plan will create more Australian jobs?
It's a good thing some people are wearing masks. The Minister for Education and Youth has
Thanks,
the call.
Mr Speaker, and I thank the member for Boothby for her question. It's nice to get a further question on education policy from this side of the House, because despite the member for Sydney interjecting over there, she's asked one question on education in 12 months. Such is her concern about education policy. Mr Speaker, an important part of our plan to secure Australia's economic recovery is to get the best brains at our universities to work with our business leaders to convert their great research into products, into new companies and ultimately into jobs and wealth creation. Now, this close collaboration between academics and businesses occurs so well in places like Silicon Valley or the innovation country of Israel, but in Australia we know that we can do better. Now, to be fair, we have brilliant research. We punch above our weight in terms of primary research, but on nearly every metric of research commercialisation, we don't do as well as where we should be, Mr Speaker. Now, we want to change this. We want to be more like the United States. We want to be more like Israel in this regards, where those universities do work with business to create the new products, to create the new companies, to drive the economy, to create wealth for the nation. And, Mr Speaker, last week we announced our first step to see this happen. And, Mr Speaker, $243 million is being invested in what we are calling trailblazer universities. And these are going to be universities that are hungry to aggressively go down the research commercialisation path and can showcase to others how it can be done. They're going to be trailblazers. They'll be focused on this task. They'll receive $50 million each in order to do the job, to recruit the best, to purchase kit, and in exchange they'll be focused very much on research commercialisation, have industrial relations frameworks to underpin it, Mr Speaker, and absolutely showcase what can be done in this particular area. Now, this has been warmly welcomed by both the business community and indeed by university leaders alike. The Business Council of Australia, for example, said that this will help give us an edge in the global battle to turn our ideas into new industries, new jobs and new opportunities. Universities Australia said that this investment, and I quote again, will ensure that the best and brightest can play their role in our nation's recovery from the pandemic, Mr Speaker. This is what this particular program is going to do. It's the first instalment of our research commercialisation agenda, Mr Speaker. There'll be more to come. We want to see our universities work with the industry to create the jobs of the future.
The member for Solomon has the call.
Thanks, Speaker. My question is to the Prime Minister. Does the Prime Minister's model of a National Anti-Corruption Commission have the power to investigate a Cabinet Minister's decision to grant visas to au pairs for mates?
The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. These questions go to the very heart, Mr Speaker, of why the model we have put forward in 349 pages of draft legislation that is there publicly available, Mr Speaker, on the Attorney-General's website, go absolutely to the issue of why, Mr Speaker, it's important that an integrity commission which is introduced not to be used and weaponised for the sort of political stunts and game playing that we're seeing here from the Labor Party. They don't want an integrity commission, Mr Speaker. They just want to engage in the slurs. Mr Speaker, criminal corrupt conduct is the sort of conduct, Mr Speaker, that sent the former Minister Ian MacDonald, Mr Speaker, to prison, which the Leader of the Opposition was a keen supporter of, Mr Speaker.
The Leader of the Opposition, on a point of order.
I ask that it be withdrawn, Mr Speaker.
Just, the Prime Minister will resume his seat. Order. It would assist the Leader of the House.
You backed him into the upper house.
Leader of the House.
Again, Mr Speaker, the standing orders are very clear. If the Leader of the Opposition claims to have been misrepresented, he should make that claim at the end of question time. If he has a question of you, he should put that question to you at that stage. Nothing that's been said is unparliamentary, or for that matter untrue, but if he claims it to be untrue, he should do so at the end of question time.
Member for Isaacs is warned. The Leader of the Opposition.
Yes, Mr Speaker. I have supported all of the processes, including the ICAC processes.
No, the Leader of the Opposition is on a point of order.
The Prime Minister cannot make the accusation which he has made, and it cannot be allowed to stand. I oppose criminal conduct, and I support the jailing of people who break the law.
Leader of the Opposition. The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The order. It's not in order for a Member of Parliament to accuse, and just hear me out for a moment, it's not in order for a Member of Parliament to accuse another Member of Parliament to have acted criminally. Over the last week, there's been discussions around mates being in jail, and it is sailing close to the wind. Whilst it's not technically a breach of the standing orders, it is sailing close to the wind. And I would just ask the Prime Minister and all members to be very, very mindful that whilst an accusation may not allude to criminal conduct, there's a form of guilt by association type arrangement, and I would ask the Prime Minister just to be careful with his wording, please.
Mr. Speaker, my statement was based simply on the fact of the Leader of the Opposition's support for Ian McDonald to be in the New South Wales Parliament, Mr. Speaker. There are matters on the public record. He can take a personal explanation if that's not true.
The Leader of the Opposition will resume his seat. The Prime Minister has the call.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm also asked about matters involving immigration, Mr. Speaker, and the conduct of people involving immigration. And the former Labor member for Dovell, Mr. Thompson, Mr. Speaker, was found guilty of 13 counts of theft for spending money on prostitutes, fine dining, and he's later been charged with...
The Manager of Opposition. Order! Order! The Manager of Opposition on point of order.
Mr. Speaker, simply on relevance. The Prime Minister is referring to conduct that is appropriately being called out. It's just not relevant to this question.
Well, the question, Manager of Opposition Business, the question was in relation to an anti-corruption commission.
What the Prime Minister is doing is saying, because there's a reference to a specific form of visa with respect to au pairs, that therefore it's open to him to talk about anything within the immigration system. That's an extraordinary stretch.
No, I don't agree. The question is in relation to anti-corruption commission, particularly in relation to visas, and the Prime Minister has the call.
Mr. Speaker, in relation to Mr. Thompson, Mr. Speaker, this is what the Leader of the Opposition had to say about him, Mr. Speaker. He said he had complete confidence in Mr. Thompson, Mr. Speaker. As we know, we saw him on the beers with Mr. Thompson, Mr. Speaker. This, Mr. Speaker, is the standard that the Leader of the Opposition set, Mr. Speaker, when he was in government. He was indeed the Leader of Government Business in this House, seeking to secure the vote of Mr. Thompson, Mr. Speaker, who has been shamed by his own actions. Mr. Speaker, those opposite talk a big game on this issue. As I said, more of their members are in the Silverwater branch of the Labor Party, Mr. Speaker, than they'd care to admit to.
The Prime Minister will withdraw that last comment, please. The Prime Minister will withdraw that last comment. Order. I just spoke about the issue of sailing close to the wind. The Prime Minister has referred to Silverwater and the Labor Party. It would assist the chair if the Prime Minister withdrew that last comment, please.
I'm happy to withdraw, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. The member for Nichols.
Thank you very much, Speaker. My question is to the Minister for Agriculture and Northern Australia. Will the Minister explain to the House how the Morrison-Joyce government's substantial investment in agricultural innovation will boost productivity, jobs, prosperity in regional Australia and assist agriculture in reaching its target of being a $100 billion industry by 2030?
The Minister for Agriculture and Northern Australia has.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the member for Nichols for his question and acknowledge the rich and very proud history that the Nichols region has in producing some of the finest food and fibre in the world, and will play a significant part in Australian agriculture reaching $100 billion. And in fact, will play a significant part in us, for the first time in our nation's history, reaching $70 billion this year. And he knows better than anyone that innovation plays a very important part in providing our farmers with the tools to be able to provide the best food and fibre in the world. And that's why we're investing and modernising our innovation systems, making sure that we put the environment and framework. We are currently ranked number 23 in the world, but we have set ourselves a target to become number 1 in the world. We have the same number of researchers and scientists as the United States and Netherlands, who are 4 and 6 in the world. So all we have to do is put the environment around the best and brightest in the world that are here to achieve that goal.
And we're doing that by, firstly, creating Agriculture Innovation Australia that will get back to the first principles of utilising the $1.1 billion worth of R&D levy dollars that go into making sure our farmers do have that research money. And that comes from the taxpayer, it comes from the levy payer. And we're getting back to first principles of value to the levy payer, value to the taxpayer, no duplication and commercialisation of what we're doing. And AIA is in fact started that journey of making sure that we're removing the duplication, saving millions of dollars of levy payers' dollars and taxpayers' dollars in removing the duplication of research across the 15 commodity RDCs that are there at the moment, getting real value for dollar for us and making it go further. We're also giving AIA the tools to be able to do this properly. We've, for the first time, created a digital platform, Grow Ag. And what that does is put all the research and development that our 15 research and development corporations have and are undertaken on a digital platform that the world can see and that, in fact, other commercial entities can see so that they can invest. And so far, since April this year, in which we launched this, there's been over 40 commercialisation opportunities that have come from that, not just from Australia, from around the world. From the 15,500 customers that looked at it from over 130 countries. We're also backing this with physical platforms that people can come and see and feel and touch the research that we are doing, because that's where you get the adoption. And we're putting one out near Shepparton at Dookie College, where we're partnering with universities to make sure that cutting-edge research can be developed and farmers can actually see and adopt it. This is making sure that we have a closed loop in terms of the environment we're creating to ensure that that investment dollar that we are putting up, that the farmers are putting up, is partnering with new commercial capital, having real results in driving not just innovation, but protecting the over 330,000 jobs in agriculture, but also creating the new jobs of agriculture into the 2030s and beyond.
The Prime Minister.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I ask that further questions be placed on the notice paper, and as